Coal mines were never quiet places, but what most people do not realize is how often the real danger came from something no one could see. Men feared fire, yet it was the dust around their boots that could tear a mountain apart. The shocking truth is that coal dust does not just burn, it explodes with a force that outruns sound itself. And once you understand how it happens, you cannot look at these disasters the same way again, because the deadliest thing underground was never the flame, it was the air they breathed. If stories like this move you, consider subscribing to our channel to help preserve the forgotten stories of those who built our world. Now, let us step into the hidden truth of why coal dust became one of the most feared forces ever unleashed underground. Was the dust already waiting? Coal mines were living systems that never truly slept. Even when the lamps were dark and the tracks silent, layers of powder settled over every surface like a veil. The men who worked those tunnels understood this dust in a way few outsiders ever could. It clung to their clothes, coated their lungs, and drifted through the air in clouds so fine they could float for hours. No one needed to be told that it was always there, waiting. It gathered in corners, packed itself onto rafters, and hid inside abandoned rooms where no light had passed in decades. This dust was not the soot a fireplace leaves behind. It was a byproduct of machines grinding coal against rock, of picks chipping the seams, of blasting powder tearing open new entries. Every action in a mine created more of it. The finer the coal, the more dangerous it became. The most lethal particles were as small as smoke, so light that a single footstep could lift them from the floor. Once airborne, the dust gained a quality that miners spoke about quietly, almost with a kind of respect. It became fuel, pure and simple. Historians studying early mining records discovered that dust was often present at explosive levels, even in mines considered well kept. Investigators after disasters in places like Sengenid, Courrières and Monongah recorded the same pattern. Long before any flame appeared, the walls had already been coated with a film of powder that needed only to be disturbed. Testimony from survivors often described a strange haze lingering in the air during normal shifts, a drifting fog that made lamps glow slightly whiter. To the untrained eye it looked harmless. To the men underground it was a warning. The danger was compounded by movement. A passing train of coal cars, a change in ventilation flow, or the shock of a small ignition could lift settled dust into the air all at once. When that happened, the mine transformed from a workplace into something closer to a bomb. Scientists later measured how quickly dust clouds could form inside a tunnel. Under the right conditions, a single disturbance could fill a passage hundreds of feet long in a matter of seconds. The dust did not just float, it spread with intent. Even routine work carried risks. In some mines, dry drilling sent clouds swirling through the headings. In others, strong air currents meant to keep men alive inadvertently stirred dust into a suspended state. Every improvement in productivity created more dust, and every attempt to clear it sometimes helped lift it off the ground. Miners knew that sweeping too vigorously could be as dangerous as striking a match. They spoke of the dust as if it had moods. Some days it hung low and heavy, other days it rose the moment a cage descended from the shaft. By the early 20th century, investigators reached a grim conclusion. Dust did not simply exist in mines, it accumulated with purpose, layer upon layer, building toward a moment when it could transform the entire underground world. When men said the dust was waiting, they were not speaking in riddles. They were stating a fact learned by those who worked close to the earth, where the smallest particles held the greatest power. The mine did not need flame to be dangerous, it needed only time. What turned the air into a trap? To understand why coal dust became so deadly, you have to imagine the air underground not as empty space, but as something that could betray the men who breathed it. In a mine, the atmosphere was never just oxygen and darkness. It was a shifting mixture of gases, vapours and particles so fine they behaved almost like mist. When coal dust lifted into that air, It changed the nature of the mine itself. The space around a miner could become fuel without him ever realizing it. Scientists later studied how dust concentrations rose and fell with the movement of air. They discovered that only a few ounces of fine coal dust, suspended in a cubic yard of air, could create a mixture powerful enough to explode with terrifying force. Most mines held far more than that in every corridor. The dust did not need to be thick enough to choke a person. It only needed to float. Once it did, the air transformed into something combustible, a medium waiting for a spark to rewrite the fate of everyone inside. Historical investigations found that this transformation occurred silently. Nothing announced the danger. In the Carreras mine, where more than 1,000 men were killed in 1906, workers had reported dusty haze long before the explosion. At Monongah, the deadliest mining disaster in American history, inspectors later wrote that the corridors were coated with layers of dust so thick they could be scraped from the walls. Yet before the blast, those tunnels seemed calm. Lamps glowed, machines hummed. The air did not look hostile, but it was. Ventilation played an unexpected role in this shift. Mines relied on complex systems of airways to carry fresh air through their workings. These currents were meant to keep methane from collecting and to give the men enough oxygen to continue their labour. But the same moving air that kept them alive could lift dust into a floating cloud. A gust in the wrong direction, or a change in pressure when doors opened or closed, might push dust into suspension. In those moments, the mine's own lifeline helped create the conditions for disaster. Every mine had spots where dust gathered more densely, old rooms where coal had once been cut, abandoned headings no longer in use, low ceilings where powder settled in drifts. When ventilation shifted, even slightly, these deposits could break loose. The air carried them forward, turning narrow corridors into channels filled with combustible fog. Miners sometimes described entering a room and noticing that the air seemed different, thicker somehow. They could not always explain the feeling, but they sensed when the atmosphere had changed in a way that made the skin on their arms tighten. The transformation was so subtle that men often kept working even as the danger formed around them. Nothing about the air looked violent. There was no glowing spark hovering in the dark, just a silent merging of dust and oxygen that turned the mine into a trap. When investigators later traced the paths of explosions, they often found the same pattern. The air itself had carried the fuel forward. It had moved freely, invisibly, preparing the ground for what came next. Once dust took hold of the atmosphere, the mine stopped behaving like stone and timber. It became something volatile, something capable of reacting faster than any man could run. The trap was not built with steel or fire. It was built with air waiting for its moment to strike. A single spark chose the moment. Every mine that ever produced coal held countless potential ignition sources, but it was the smallest ones that carried the greatest threat. A spark could come from a tool striking stone, a misfired charge, a slipping steel pick, or even the friction of machinery pushed too hard. There were days when men saw brief flashes in the dark, tiny bursts of light that vanished before anyone had time to react. Most passed harmlessly. A few changed history. The danger lay not in the spark itself, but in what the air had become before the spark arrived. In the early years of mining, open flame lamps were common. Their warm glow filled the tunnels, but each flame carried the possibility of rising hotter than expected. Even a lamp brushed against a coat or jolted by a stumble could break its protective shield and release enough heat to ignite suspended dust nearby. Miners knew this, which was why safety lamps were treated with near-religious care. Still, accidents happened. A lamp dropped from a hook, a glass cracked under pressure. In those moments, dust did not hesitate. Blasting created even greater risks. Black powder and later dynamite were essential for opening new headings, but a miscalculated charge could shake loose dust in enormous quantities. Investigators studying old disasters often found that the initial explosion was small, sometimes barely powerful enough to crack a timber. But the shockwave lifted dust into the air, forming a cloud that ignited when a second spark appeared a heartbeat later. The ignition was not a single event. It was a chain reaction, each link feeding the next until the mine itself seemed to inhale sharply and then release its fury. Machinery introduced another source of ignition. By the late 19th century, cutting machines and metal conveyors clattered through the mines. Their steel teeth ground against rock, sending out tiny eruptions of sparks. Most scattered onto damp ground and faded harmlessly. But in dry sections where dust lay thickly, those same sparks could drift upward into a cloud too thin for the eye to register. When they found the right mix of air and powder, they ignited with an efficiency that shocked investigators for decades afterward. Even clothing could set off disaster. Wool coats rubbed against dry timber, generating static that snapped in the darkness. Few miners considered it dangerous. But on more than one occasion, witnesses described hearing a faint crackle moments before the shockwave reached them. The spark had come not from machinery or powder, but from the simple act of brushing past a dusty wall. Coal dust did not discriminate. Any spark would do. Historical records show that many explosions began in silence. A miner swung a pick. A cart rolled over a rail. A minor charge detonated in a side chamber. The men nearby barely noticed. Then, somewhere behind them, the dust cloud ignited. Survivors often spoke of a sudden brightening of the air, a flash so brief it seemed imagined. That flash was the moment the spark chose its target. It was irreversible. The true horror lay in how little force was needed. A spark no larger than the strike of a match could trigger a blast that tore through miles of tunnels. The mine did not care about the spark's size, it cared only that it arrived when the dust was ready. Once the ignition occurred, the fuse had been lit and the mine would answer with everything it held inside. What struck before the flame? When coal dust ignited, the first danger was not the fire but the pressure it unleashed. Men who survived the earliest moments of an explosion often described hearing something like a distant roar, a rushing sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It arrived before they saw any flame, before heat reached their skin, before the lamps around them flickered. That roar was the expanding force of air being pushed violently ahead of the fire, a shockwave moving faster than human instinct could register. By the time a miner realized what he was hearing, the pressure had already struck. Investigators who studied disasters like the one at the Willow Grove mine in 1940 found that coal dust explosions produced pressure fronts strong enough to peel timbers apart. Doors designed to direct ventilation flows were torn from their hinges and hurled hundreds of feet down entries. Brattice cloth used to guide air currents shredded instantly. Even reinforced stoppings, structures meant to withstand substantial force, collapsed as the air rushed past them with the strength of a gale. This was not the quiet push of a furnace. It was a wall of compressed air moving with the violence of a storm. The pressure wave formed because coal dust did not burn like wood or coal lumps. It combusted almost instantly, releasing gases at speeds that defied expectation. The chemical reaction happened so rapidly that the surrounding air expanded in a sudden burst, creating a high-pressure front that travelled far ahead of the actual flame. In some historical cases, survivors reported feeling the air collapse around them, as if the mine were inhaling sharply. Then came the blow. The pressure wave struck with enough force to throw men from their feet and extinguish their lamps before the fire ever entered the chamber. One of the most chilling accounts came from the Cuchieres disaster. Rescuers found entire sections of the mine where the flame had barely touched the walls, yet every structure inside had been flattened. The pressure wave had done the destruction long before any fire arrived. It stripped layers of coal dust from the timbers and hurled them further into the mine, feeding the explosion as it moved. The blast gained strength not by burning its way through the tunnels, but by throwing fuel ahead of itself, a self-sustaining momentum that no man underground could outrun. Scientists studying later explosions recreated these pressure fronts in controlled chambers. They observed how even a small ignition could produce a wave strong enough to break windows and collapse partitions. In a confined space like a mine, the effect multiplied. The pressure reflected off walls, converged in narrow passages and accelerated down slopes. In some shafts, the wave descended faster than sound, reaching men who had heard nothing until the moment the air itself slammed into them. For miners, the most terrifying part was how invisible the threat remained until it was too late. A man might hear a strange vibration in the timbers or feel a sudden gust against his back. Then, in a single instant, the shockwave struck with a force that stripped the breath from his lungs. Only afterward, if he survived, would he see the fire sweeping behind it. The pressure told the mine's story first. The flame merely confirmed what had already begun. A shockwave in the darkness. When a coal dust explosion began, the first force to move through the mine was not flame or smoke. It was something far more unsettling, a surge that seemed to travel with purpose. Miners who survived early blasts often spoke of hearing a rushing sound, as if the mine itself were exhaling. They felt the air shift, pulling loose dust from the timbered walls and pushing it forward into the dark. That movement, swift and unseen, was the beginning of a chain reaction. It was the explosion gathering speed as it swept through the tunnels. Scientists studying historic disasters eventually learned that a coal dust blast behaves less like a fire and more like a rolling shock front. The flame behind it created a pressure wave that raced through the air faster than most men could comprehend. In narrow entries, the wave accelerated, feeding on the confined space. It lifted dust from the floor, ripped it from ledges, and sent it swirling upward. Each new cloud became fuel that waited only a fraction of a second before igniting. The explosion did not have to chase the dust. The dust rushed to meet it. Investigators at Monongah found evidence that the blast there travelled through multiple branches of the mine almost simultaneously. Timbers separated by hundreds of yards were destroyed in the same instant. Some survivors described feeling a pulse of wind past them, a strange pressure that made the air tighten. Only after that did the fire appear, sweeping through the entry with a ferocity that left nothing recognizable. The speed was unlike anything seen in surface fires. Underground, the blast had the advantage of direction. The tunnels guided it like a barrel guides a bullet. In the Courrières mine, the explosion moved so fast that some men deeper inside were killed before those closer to the ignition point. The pressure wave raced into remote workings, igniting dust far ahead of the flame front. By the time the fire reached those areas, the damage had already been done. The speed of propagation frightened investigators, who realized that the explosion had behaved like a living thing, adapting to each passage, accelerating as it found new dust to devour. Airflow played a crucial role. Ventilation currents designed to keep methane from accumulating often became pathways for destruction. If a mine's air moved swiftly, the explosion moved with it. If the currents divided, the blast followed both branches. In some cases, the cloud of dust ahead of the fire became thick enough to momentarily darken lamps even before the pressure wave arrived. A miner might see the air shift in front of him, the tunnel dimming for a breath, and then the roar would follow. Darkness served as the only warning. What shocked investigators most was how the passing wave could remain ahead of the very flame that created it. Experiments later showed that the pressure front could move at speeds approaching 1,000 feet per second under the worst conditions. With each chamber it entered, it tore more dust from the walls. With each step forward, it created more fuel. The mine became a series of fuses, each igniting the next in rapid succession. For those caught underground, it felt like being overtaken by something unstoppable. Not flame, not heat, but a force that moved with the speed of instinct, racing through the darkness long before any man understood what had arrived. It was not the fire that chose its direction. It was the mine guiding the blast, accelerating it and sending it forward with a speed that defied belief. Every chamber held its own secret. In the aftermath of nearly every major coal mine explosion, investigators found the same unsettling pattern. The ignition might begin in one spot, but the destruction leapt across the workings as if the mine had hidden 1,000 small charges in the dark. Each chamber, each crosscut, each abandoned heading contained its own store of dust. These pockets were not dangerous on their own. They sat quietly, undisturbed, sometimes for years. But once the pressure wave reached them, they came alive, turning a single blast into an unfolding catastrophe. Historical records from mines like Dar, Monongah, and Eccles describe these chambers in haunting detail. Some were old rooms where coal had once been cut, their floors layered with fine powder that workers rarely disturbed. Others were low-roofed sections where dust collected on rafters in sheets so delicate they trembled with each passing footstep. Still others were abandoned routes sealed off decades earlier, yet filled with the residue of long-forgotten shifts. The danger lay not only in how much dust these chambers held, but in how perfectly they waited for the right moment to release it. When the initial explosion began its sweep, the pressure wave struck each chamber like a hammer. The shock lifted dust into the air all at once, creating dense clouds that hovered at breathing height. The flame front following behind did not need to search for fuel. The fuel rose to meet it. With each chamber it entered, the explosion intensified. Investigators would later walk these routes and find walls scoured clean, the dust torn away by the force of the blast. The rooms themselves served as evidence of how the explosion had gathered strength with each new pocket of powder. In some disasters, witnesses reported hearing multiple blasts echoing through the mine, each one slightly louder than the last. These were not separate explosions. They were chambers igniting in rapid sequence, each adding new force to the one behind it. The explosion did not travel in a single line. It branched outward, following side passages, drifting into forgotten rooms and igniting them in turn. The mine, with its network of entries and chambers, functioned like a labyrinth of interconnected fuses. The secrets held in these chambers were not always obvious. A room might appear clean to the eye, its floor damp from groundwater seepage. Yet above the beams, on old ledges and support joints, dust gathered in fragile layers that could be lifted by the slightest disturbance. When the pressure wave entered, those layers disintegrated instantly. In the Eccles disaster of 1914, investigators found evidence that the blast had ignited dust on ceiling beams 30 feet above the floor. The flame itself had not reached that high. The pressure wave did the work for it. Old workings presented even greater risks. Mines abandoned for years still held dust deep within their entries, and many explosions vented into these forgotten spaces. Once ignited, the rooms acted as amplifiers, adding force and throwing even more dust back into active workings. There were cases where rescuers found destruction in parts of a mine that had been sealed off long before. The explosion had found a way in, feeding on whatever dust it encountered. The terrifying truth was that every chamber held a secret because every chamber held potential fuel. The mine remembered every shift worked, every cut made, every pile of dust never cleared. When the moment came, those memories ignited one by one, turning quiet rooms into engines of destruction that worked together, chamber after chamber, until the mine itself seemed to burn from the inside out. The Unsuspecting Weapon. Ventilation was supposed to be the lifeblood of a coal mine. It carried fresh air into the headings, pushed methane away from the faces, and kept the temperature from rising to unbearable levels. Without steady airflow, no man could work more than a few minutes underground. But in the history of mining, there were countless moments when the very system meant to protect workers turned against them. When coal dust rose into the air, the wind that once sustained life became a weapon, guiding destruction through the dark with silent precision. To understand how this happened, you have to picture the mine not as a series of disconnected rooms, but as a single breathing organism. Large fans on the surface pulled air through miles of tunnels, pushing it through regulator doors, over stoppings, and around turns carved decades apart. When the system worked perfectly, it kept the mine safe. But a dust explosion did not respect a perfect system. As soon as the ignition occurred, the pressure wave collided with the moving air, twisting the currents into unpredictable patterns. The wind, once steady, accelerated into narrow passages and dragged dust clouds with it, like a tide pulling sand from a beach. Historical investigations revealed that ventilation often dictated the path of destruction. In the Cross Mountain disaster of 1911, investigators discovered that the explosion travelled exactly along the main airflow line. Where the air moved quickly, the blast intensified. Where the current slowed, the explosion weakened. The greatest damage always occurred in the fastest moving air. Ventilation, designed to keep men breathing, became a corridor that carried the explosion deeper into the mine than flame alone ever could have reached. Dust made the problem worse. Strong air currents lifted powder that had settled harmlessly for months. Timbers that looked clean from the floor hid layers of fine dust high above, and the moving air brushed it loose with each passing minute. In some parts of mines, air travelled quickly enough to keep dust suspended indefinitely. Those areas looked deceptively safe. The floor remained clear, the walls clean, yet the air itself flickered with tiny particles invisible to the naked eye. A single spark would turn that air into fuel. When an explosion began, the airflow also determined which chambers ignited first. Ventilation doors that were supposed to regulate pressure often became launching points. If a door was blown open, even by a small ignition, the sudden change in airflow pulled dust from adjacent rooms and fed it into the oncoming fire. In disasters like the one at the Dawson mine in 1913, rescuers later found doors twisted in their frames, pointing in the direction the explosion had travelled. The wind had chosen the path, and the explosion had followed. Even the return airways posed danger. These passages carried used air out of the mine, often through older, dustier sections. When the pressure wave reached these returns, it accelerated rapidly. The dust suspended there ignited in violent bursts that echoed back into active headings. Miners who had no connection to the blast area sometimes died simply because the airflow brought the explosion to them in seconds. The greatest irony was that miners depended on the wind for survival. They listened for it, relied on it, trusted it. Yet in every major dust explosion, the wind played a decisive role. It gathered the dust, shaped the fire, carried the pressure, and delivered the blast to men who never saw the ignition point. What was meant to protect them instead guided the disaster forward with the cold efficiency of a force that had forgotten its purpose. Underground, even the wind had the power to turn against them. When did the darkness start hunting? Long before the flame or the pressure wave reached most miners, the first sign of disaster was usually the dark. Not the ordinary darkness of a mine, which every worker understood intimately, but a deeper kind of shadow that moved differently. Lamps dimmed without warning. Air grew thick in a way that made men lift their heads, sensing something they could not name. It was in those moments, seconds before the shockwave arrived, that the darkness itself seemed to come alive. It crept through the tunnels as if it was searching for someone. This strange phenomenon appeared again and again in survivor accounts. In the Darmine disaster of 1907, the few who lived described seeing their lights flicker and shrink to thin, trembling points. They did not hear an explosion. They did not smell smoke. They only felt the darkness closing in, as if the mine were drawing every bit of breath from the air. That change was caused by dust rising in massive volumes, pulled upward by the sudden shift in pressure. The suspended particles swallowed the light, turning the tunnel into a place where even a few feet ahead became invisible. In many disasters, rescuers later found lamps extinguished without a trace of heat or fire. They realized these lamps had gone dark long before the flame front arrived. The pressure wave had stripped oxygen from the air, creating a pocket where nothing could burn. Men caught in these zones often died without a mark on them. They had been overtaken by the darkness before they understood what it meant. The mine had changed the air itself into something that could smother them quietly. As the explosion grew, the darkness deepened. Dust clouds thickened into rolling masses that travelled with the pressure wave. These clouds absorbed light so completely that even rescuers with powerful lamps years later found it hard to imagine what miners had faced. Investigators at the Mount Mulligan disaster in Australia reported that the dust layer was so heavy in some entries that it appeared to be floating, forming a soft, shifting ceiling that hid whatever dangers waited above. When the flame swept through, it ignited those suspended layers instantly, sending sheets of fire racing along the roof. Darkness also hid the paths the explosion followed. It made the mine feel larger, disorienting men who tried to escape. Corridors that seemed familiar were swallowed by shadows. Ventilation doors vanished. Tracks disappeared beneath drifting powder. In the Cross Mountain rescue logs, search teams described losing their sense of direction as the dust-saturated air reduced visibility to almost nothing. Even after the explosion, the darkness lingered, refusing to lift. It clung to the walls like a memory of what had passed. For trapped miners, the darkness became more than the absence of light. It became a presence, something that travelled ahead of the fire like a warning delivered too late. They felt pressure change before they heard anything. They sensed the sudden coldness that followed the shockwave. They watched their lamps shrink to embers, then blacken entirely, leaving them alone with nothing but the sound of shifting air and distant echoes they could not identify. In the end, the darkness hunted because it moved with the explosion's logic. It arrived before heat, before flame, before the collapse. It claimed the tunnels first, blinding the men who might have found a path to safety. Long before rescuers arrived, the mine had already taken hold of the light and snuffed it out. Underground, the darkness was never just a backdrop. It was the first force to strike. Investigators feared this most. When rescue crews finally entered a mine after an explosion, they stepped into a world frozen at the moment of destruction. Timbers lay splintered in directions that made no sense. Doors that once controlled the airflow were twisted flat against the walls. Tools rested beside their owners, untouched by flame but marked by the pressure that had struck first. In this silence, investigators searched for answers, but the deeper they looked, the more unsettling the truth became. The mine had not simply burned. It had behaved like a weapon built by centuries of accumulated dust and forgotten rooms. From the earliest reports at Curious to the detailed analyses at Monongah and Farmington, investigators found patterns that repeated with uncanny precision. The ignition point often told only a fraction of the story. The true power of the explosion came from somewhere else. In every major dust disaster, the mine itself amplified the blast, feeding it through pockets of fine powder that had gathered unnoticed for years. These rooms acted like silent reservoirs of fuel. Investigators feared this truth because it meant the danger had been present long before the spark appeared. The most frightening discovery was how small the initial flame could be. Post-disaster reconstructions showed that some of the worst explosions began with charges too weak to break timber. In other cases, a tool strike or a single lamp failure started the chain, yet the aftermath looked like the work of something far more violent. In the rolling mill mine disaster of 1902, experts found that the first ignition barely scorched the wall. What came afterward was responsible for the devastation. The mine had long prepared itself for that moment. As investigators followed the blast's path, they saw how the pressure wave had chosen its direction. It travelled through main headings, drifted into abandoned chambers, and ignited dust so thoroughly that some rooms burned from ceiling to floor. In several disasters, the flame front left little soot behind, a sign of near-perfect combustion. This level of intensity terrified researchers because it revealed how efficiently the mine had arranged its fuel. The dust was so fine and so evenly dispersed once lifted into the air that the explosion consumed it completely. Even more troubling were the findings in entries where bodies showed no sign of burning, These men had died from the blast's pressure, not the fire. Their lamps lay unharmed beside them. Their clothing showed no scorch marks. Investigators realized the mine could kill long before the flame arrived. This truth reshaped the entire understanding of underground danger. Fire had always been feared, but now the emphasis shifted. Dust, invisible and silent, posed the greater threat. These discoveries forced mining officials to reconsider everything they believed about safety. The old assumption that explosions resulted mostly from methane was no longer defensible. Methane ignited the air, but dust carried the destruction forward. At Farmington in 1968, researchers found blast patterns that could only be explained by dust ignition. The walls were stripped clean in long, smooth arcs. Timbers were powdered into fragments. These signatures revealed a force capable of accelerating far beyond what methane alone could create. The truth investigators feared most was not that a spark could start a fire, but that a mine full of dust could finish it in a way that no man could outrun. The combustible air, the hidden chambers, the shifting ventilation currents, all of it worked together to create a system that acted with ruthless efficiency. And this realization carried a grim implication. Many of the worst disasters were not accidents that happened suddenly. They were tragedies waiting patiently, built by time, dust, and silence. Investigators feared this not because it was dramatic, but because it was preventable. The survival rules followed the science. In the years following the great coal mine disasters, a difficult truth took shape. Men couldn't hope to survive underground unless they understood the force that killed more miners than fire, more than roof falls, more than gas. The danger was not simply the flame, it was the dust that lay underfoot, clung to rafters, and drifted silently in the air. To live another shift, miners had to recognize that their greatest enemy was something they could barely see. Survival required knowledge, discipline, and a willingness to treat the dust as a threat equal to any weapon. Before modern research explained dust explosions in scientific terms, much of this understanding grew from experience. Old miners taught younger ones to watch the air, to pay attention to how a lamp's glow changed when dust began to rise. They warned against sweeping too aggressively and reminded men to dampen the floor whenever possible. These habits were not rituals. They were survival techniques born from generations of observation. In places like Scotland, Pennsylvania, and the Ruhr, men learned to sense danger before they could explain it. The mine rewarded such awareness and punished its absence without mercy. By the early 20th century, governments and mining companies began confronting the truth that investigators had feared for decades. Dust control was not optional, it was essential. Stone dusting emerged as one of the most important advances. Miners spread powdered limestone across floors, ledges, and rafters to dilute the coal dust. When an explosion began, the limestone absorbed heat, slowing the chain reaction. This method did not eliminate danger, but it created a crucial barrier. Mines that adopted rigorous stone dusting saw a dramatic decline in catastrophic explosions. Watering systems offered another layer of defense. Crews used hoses, sprinklers, and sprays to keep dust from rising during cutting and drilling operations. Some mines installed permanent overhead pipes that released fine mists to settle floating particles. These measures were not perfect. Dry seasons, equipment failures, and poor maintenance still allowed dust to gather in dangerous quantities, but they represented a turning point. Miners and engineers were no longer pretending the dust would take care of itself. They were fighting it directly. Ventilation practices changed as well. Engineers redesigned airflow systems to reduce the chances of dust collecting in high-velocity zones. Regulators balanced air pressures more carefully, preventing sudden gusts that could lift dust clouds into suspension. Doors were strengthened, stoppings were rebuilt, airways were expanded. In the most advanced mines, air samples were taken regularly to test dust concentration. Workers were taught to understand not just where the air flowed, but how the air behaved. Yet even with improvements, the lessons carried a somber weight. Disasters continued to occur, sometimes because of rare conditions, other times because of decisions made in haste or neglect. At the Farmington mine in 1968, dust once again played a role in magnifying the blast. The disaster served as a grim reminder that knowledge alone was never enough, unless paired with constant vigilance. Mines could forget the danger, but the dust never did. The men who survived these explosions often spoke of the mine in almost human terms. They said it remembered every shift, every stroke of a pick, every blast that sent powder drifting into the air. That memory waited in the darkness until the wrong spark arrived. Understanding this made survival possible. Ignoring it made disaster inevitable. In the end, the path to safety was built not only on technology but on respect. Respect for the dust, the air, and the hidden forces that shaped life underground. The miners who lived longest were the ones who recognized that the true killer was not the flame, but everything the flame awakened. Survival demanded knowing the enemy, and in coal country the enemy was always waiting,